Everyone thinks arguing is universal. You get mad, you yell, problem solved, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. What if I told you that how people fight reveals more about their cultural DNA than how they love, work, or even worship? Buckle up, because we're about to dive into the secret world of cultural combat styles. And trust me, this is going to shatter everything you thought you knew about human conflict. Here's the thing nobody talks about. Arguing isn't just arguing. It's a highly sophisticated cultural performance that follows invisible rules passed down through generations. Americans argue like they're lawyers in a courtroom drama. Germans argue like they're debugging code. Italians argue like they're conducting an opera. And the British, they argue like they're apologizing for existing while simultaneously destroying your soul. Let's start with the Americans, because their arguing style is basically cultural imperialism in conversational form. Americans argue to win, period. It's not about understanding, it's not about harmony, it's about being right and making sure everyone knows it. They've turned disagreement into competitive sport. American arguing follows what researchers call adversarial discourse. Two sides, clear positions, may the loudest logic win. They interrupt constantly, not because they're rude, but because in American culture, if you're not fighting for speaking time, you're not really participating. The psychological driver here is fascinating. American arguing stems from their core belief that conflict leads to progress. They literally think that the best ideas emerge from intellectual combat. It's like they've convinced themselves that arguing is a form of democracy. Everyone gets to present their case, and somehow truth will emerge victorious. This is why Americans can argue passionately and then grab drinks together afterward. For them, arguing isn't personal, it's procedural. Now flip to German arguing style, and you'll witness what I call systematic destruction. Germans don't argue. They methodically dismantle your position piece by piece until nothing remains but rubble and regret. They prepare for arguments like they're writing doctoral dissertations. Germans will show up to a casual disagreement with charts, historical precedents, and logical frameworks that would make philosophers weep. The cultural logic behind German arguing is their obsession with thoroughness and accuracy. They're not trying to win fast. They're trying to win forever. German arguing aims for what they call Klarstellung, complete clarification that makes future arguments impossible. They'd rather spend 3 hours resolving a disagreement properly than have the same fight 17 times. It's efficiency applied to human conflict, and it's both terrifying and oddly admirable. Italian arguing is performance art disguised as disagreement. Italians don't just argue with words, they argue with their entire bodies, their extended families, and apparently the ghosts of their ancestors. Italian arguments involve more hand gestures than a runway marshal and more emotional intensity than a Shakespeare tragedy. But here's the secret. Italian arguing isn't really about the topic at hand. It's about emotional expression and social bonding. Italian culture operates on what anthropologists call high-context communication, combined with emotional expressiveness. When Italians argue, they're not just exchanging information. They're sharing feelings, reinforcing relationships, and demonstrating their passion about life itself. The volume isn't aggression. It's engagement. Italian families can have screaming matches over dinner plans and then sit down together for the most loving meal you've ever witnessed. The arguing is actually a form of intimacy. British arguing is psychological warfare disguised as polite conversation. The British have weaponized politeness to the point where they can completely destroy you while sounding like they're offering you tea. British arguing follows what I call indirect annihilation. They'll never directly tell you you're wrong, but by the end of the conversation, you'll somehow feel like apologizing for existing. The British argue through what linguists call mitigated speech. Everything is softened, qualified, and wrapped in so many layers of politeness that the actual criticism becomes almost invisible. They'll say things like, "I wonder if you might consider the possibility that perhaps there could be another way of looking at this, if you don't mind me saying so." What they mean is, you're completely wrong and everyone knows it. It's arguing by stealth, and it's devastatingly effective. French arguing is intellectual theater performed for an audience of philosophers. The French don't argue to resolve disagreements. They argue to demonstrate their superior reasoning abilities and cultural sophistication. French arguments sound like university lectures delivered by people who are personally offended by logical inconsistency. They argue not just with facts, but with style points. French culture values intellectual discourse as a form of entertainment and social bonding. French arguing follows what they call l'art de la discussion, the art of discussion. It's not enough to be right, you must be elegantly right. French people can argue about abstract philosophical concepts for hours not because they disagree, but because they enjoy the mental exercise. They argue like other cultures play sports, for the joy of skillful performance. Japanese arguing doesn't exist in the way Westerners understand it. Instead, the Japanese have developed what I call conflict through consensus building. Japanese disagreement happens through elaborate rituals of face-saving, indirect suggestion, and collective decision-making that can take weeks to resolve what Americans would settle in 5 minutes of shouting. Japanese culture operates on the principle that direct confrontation damages social harmony, so they've created sophisticated systems for expressing disagreement without anyone losing face. Japanese arguing involves reading subtle social cues, understanding unspoken implications, and navigating complex hierarchies of respect. It's like arguing in code, where the actual disagreement is never explicitly stated but somehow gets resolved through collective understanding. Middle Eastern arguing, and I'm generalizing across very diverse cultures here, tends to follow what I call passionate persuasion. Middle Eastern arguing combines emotional intensity with rhetorical sophistication. It's not just about being right. It's about convincing others through the sheer force of your conviction and eloquence. Middle Eastern cultures often value oratory skills and passionate expression as signs of intelligence and sincerity. Their arguing style incorporates storytelling, emotional appeals, and complex social dynamics. The goal isn't just to win the argument. It's to demonstrate your wisdom, your passion, and your commitment to truth. Middle Eastern arguing can sound aggressive to Western ears, but it's actually a sophisticated form of persuasive communication. Scandinavian arguing is like watching people politely disagree themselves into submission. Scandinavians argue through what I call consensus-seeking conflict. They disagree so diplomatically that sometimes you can't tell if they're arguing or agreeing. Scandinavian arguing aims for what they call lagom, balance and moderation in all things, including disagreement. The cultural driver here is their commitment to social equality and collective decision-making. Scandinavians argue not to dominate, but to find solutions that everyone can live with. They'll spend enormous amounts of time ensuring that every voice is heard and every perspective is considered. It's arguing as democratic process, and while it can be frustratingly slow, it produces remarkably durable agreements. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The digital age has created hybrid arguing styles that mix cultural approaches in fascinating ways. Online arguing has become this weird fusion where people use American directness, German systematicness, Italian passion, and British passive aggression all in the same thread. Social media has created a global arguing style that's somehow both more direct and more performative than anything we've seen before. The generational differences within cultures are creating their own arguing revolution. Young Germans are adding emotional expression to their systematic approach. Young Italians are incorporating more structured logic into their passionate performances. Young Americans are learning indirect communication styles from global online communities. We're witnessing the evolution of cultural arguing styles in real time. Here's my controversial take that's going to make people mad. Some cultures are objectively better at productive conflict than others. German and Scandinavian arguing styles actually resolve problems and build understanding. American arguing creates winners and losers. Italian arguing builds relationships but doesn't always solve issues. British arguing maintains politeness but often leaves problems unresolved. French arguing is intellectually satisfying but practically useless. The business implications are huge. International companies are failing because they don't understand that Germans need systematic problem solving, Americans need clear victories, Italians need emotional acknowledgement, and Japanese need face-saving consensus. Mismatched arguing styles in multinational teams create more problems than cultural differences in work ethic or time management. But here's the plot twist nobody expects. The most effective arguing happens when people understand and adapt their conflict style to their audience. The best international negotiators aren't the ones with the strongest arguing style. They're the cultural chameleons who can argue like Germans with Germans, like Italians with the Japanese. The real revelation is that every culture's arguing style reflects their deepest values about truth, relationships, and social organization. Americans argue like individualists because they believe truth emerges from competition. Germans argue like systematists because they believe truth comes from thorough analysis. Italians argue like emotionalists because they believe truth includes feelings. The British argue like diplomatists because they believe truth should preserve social harmony. We're all walking around with invisible arguing software programmed by our cultures, and most of us don't even realize it. Understanding these patterns doesn't just make you better at cross-cultural communication. It makes you better at understanding why people in your own culture drive you crazy when they disagree with you. If you enjoyed this cultural deep dive, smash that like button, subscribe for more mind-bending cultural insights, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Which culture should I decode next? See you in the next one.